Nightcrawler is by far one of my favorite X-Men, without a shadow of a doubt. I think he's one of the most fun characters in the X-Men, and I felt like X-Men Evolution truly brought his character to life in a way other adaptations don't seem to do nearly as well, and that's by making him an exceptional background character. That's right. Nightcrawler in this show is never really he's a main character, but he's not going to be the center of a majority of stories. He's always splitting time with somebody else, even in episodes that are uniquely his own. And that's because I think that's where he shines brightest, is being an accessory to these other characters, when he's allowed to play off these other characters, and it's not just a sole episode about himself. And because of this, I want to cover Nightcrawler just a little bit differently than I did the rest of the characters from the show, where I was going in order. Instead, I want to go slightly out of order after we cover his initial introductory episode. Nightcrawler is an outcast among outcasts, even as an X-Men and as a mutant. Shout out to you all who got that reference. Because he is blue and furry. His mutation took on a more physical toll on him as compared to a lot of mutants. He is unique in that sense, but he feels extraordinarily ostracized. The first time Scott meets him, Scott ends up being afraid of Nightcrawler slightly because he's not like everybody else. And Nightcrawler recognizes this, and pretty much doesn't feel safe showing himself off to a lot of people, and is often ashamed of the way in which he looks. Something that he'll spend a lot of time trying to get over.
Happy? How can I be happy when I look like this? I scare people.
Which is honestly so terrible, because Nightcrawler at his core is just such a good dude. He's just happy-go-lucky and extremely fun. So when he arrives at the Institute and is given a way for him to blend in with everybody else, he is beyond ecstatic. It's essentially a shape-changing device that uses holograms in order to make him look more normal, something in which he definitely wants to use almost at all times. But I think Kurt was even more excited to just find somewhere that he is accepted. As well, he's excited to be an X-Men. He wants to be somewhere he's accepted, he wants to be a part of a team, and he is more than willing to do so. Although, if not a bit overly enthusiastic. You see, this entire episode, Scott and the rest of the X-Men have been trying to recruit Toad, a new mutant that has appeared at Bayville High, and, well, let's just say Mystique got to Toad first, and so now Toad is attacking the X-Mansion under her prerogative. And Kurt, when deciding to attack back, was not exactly very kind, and as a matter of fact, got them both trapped in the danger room, in which either one of them could have been hurt severely. This of course leads Nightcrawler to feel like a genuine failure for doing all of this. Not only is he still feeling like an outcast, but he also feels like he might have just scorned away the only people that care about him.
I blew it too, Professor. I'm sorry. You've been wonderful, but I guess I just don't belong here.
It's honestly pretty sad in the way in which Kurt just doesn't feel he belongs, especially because he doesn't just have full control of his powers yet either, meaning sometimes when he bamfs, especially emotionally, he goes places he doesn't want to. Thankfully, he ended up in a place in which Scott could go and talk to him, and this is really when we get to see him being accepted by somebody who initially, at least supposedly, rejected him, in that being Scott. Scott goes from recoiling at him to thinking of Nightcrawler as family.
That's why we'd like you to stay.
And you don't mind the way I look?
Dude, just don't hassle me about my shades and we'll call it even.
And this begins the nature of one of the three main relationships Kurt has throughout this first season, and that starts with his relationship with Scott, where Scott sort of fills that older brother protective role for Nightcrawler, with Nightcrawler filling in as sort of the younger brother. We see this especially in the very next episode, when Nightcrawler is once again running late to school because he decided to stop off and get some breakfast, and while he's being accosted by the principal, Miss Darkholme, Scott has to swoop in and save the day once again, just sort of protecting Kurt in a way in which he probably hasn't experienced being an only child before. This entire episode just serves not only as a somewhat Logan-centric episode with the subplot, but also serves to just give Kurt and Scott something to do and give us a base foundation for their relationship going forward throughout this show, which I find to be spectacular. I really loved Kurt and Scott's relationship, and even though this isn't necessarily an episode dedicated to them, they are given some spotlight with the B plot, and are given a nice look in trying to help Wolverine fend off one of his foes from the past, even if Wolverine himself isn't really too receptive to just about any of this.
Fight your battles, so don't fight mine.
Ah, he loves us.
Oh yeah, big time.
But their relationship isn't perfect, just like most brotherly relationships. I know mine and my brother's definitely wasn't perfect. So we get to see this play out in an episode dedicated to Kurt wanting to go to a party and wanting to hang out and be himself, but Scott doesn't want him to do this at all, fearing that Kurt will expose himself, but Scott goes about it in not the greatest of ways.
You pulled my tail, man!
Grow up, Kurt.
Hey, lighten up, dude!
You're always goofing around.
And you're seriously cramping my style!
And while Scott and Nightcrawler's beef was kind of a B plot in this episode, it did serve to push the entire A plot. The entire episode is essentially based upon the fact that Kurt, wanting to get away from Scott, ends up in the school basement, in which he finds the lab of Forge. Yes, this is this show's version of Forge, and he ends up in another pocket dimension that Forge had created back in the 70s. You know, that's after Nightcrawler ends up getting Forge's lab to explode, and Rogue finds him and then inadvertently sends him to said pocket dimension because Nightcrawler just is so unlucky in this show. And in this pocket dimension, we're going to see essentially plots A and B run congruently. Plot A being the fact that Kurt is stuck in this pocket dimension and is trying to find a way out as best as he can, and plot B is that Scott and the rest of the X-Men are going to spend the entire rest of the episode searching for Nightcrawler, especially Scott, who feels genuinely terrible for the way in which he treated Nightcrawler earlier. Scott knew immediately that he was being too hard on Nightcrawler, even after Nightcrawler bamfed initially. And this is, of course, extremely upsetting to Scott, someone who views Nightcrawler as family and also knows that Nightcrawler just wants to goof around and have parties sometimes. And of course, Nightcrawler is going to learn throughout the course of this episode, especially working with Forge, that sometimes he just has to take things more seriously. It was an episode used, in my opinion, best to move Scott's character along, but we also do see minor character movement for Nightcrawler himself, especially as he runs into more mutants, and he is kind of our gateway character towards these new mutants as well. And then, of course, this episode had some, I don't know, poorly aged jokes, I would say, revolving around women and women's locker rooms.
Just how far does this Middleverse extend?
Stops just short of the girls' locker room. Isn't that a burn?
In the end, it takes the combined effort of not only the X-Men, but Rogue as well in order to get Kurt out of this pocket dimension. And it also serves to highlight that both Kitty and Spike are fairly smart. And Scott is kind of extraordinarily headstrong and just wants to destroy the device, hoping that it would bring Nightcrawler back. It takes communication on both of their ends via a small chance to teleport into the physical world once again for them to be able to not blow up the machine and actually bring Nightcrawler forward. I also want to note once again that Scott was genuinely pushing for the charge to get Nightcrawler back and was genuinely freaking out about it, as the two characters have become extremely close throughout a majority of this season. And of course, they do have a run-in with the Brotherhood, whom noticeably have Rogue absent from their team. More on that later, but regardless, Nightcrawler, Forge are both able to get out of the pocket dimension, and Forge is able to finally go home to his family, and Nightcrawler and Cyclops get to finally reconcile how they were dealing with each other earlier, and just serve to strengthen their bond further as sort of sibling types.
No, it was on me too.
Maybe you're right. I take things too seriously. I need to lighten up some.
I really enjoyed this episode because it not only served to lighten Scott up, but also just gave me a lot of fun Nightcrawler moments, especially when he got his time to shine by himself for a little bit, which is honestly amazing, even though I do believe that he is best played when used to play off of another character. I do also just like getting to see him on his own because he's one of my favorite X-Men. But while the rest of them are celebrating, there is one member of the X-Men who wasn't on the team at that time who just had to look away from a different vantage point. I think the character that Kurt not only has the most in common with, but as well has the most influence over throughout this first season is Rogue. Now, I think it's fair that we need to explain where Rogue is in the timeline now, since I said this would be a little bit out of order. By this point, Rogue has already had her introductory episode in which she has learned about her powers and just how devastating they can be, and how she feels outcasted even amongst mutants. If you get that reference, you get that reference. And by this point, she has already been vilified in the eyes of the X-Men by accident, as of course Mystique was manipulating her. And when she has her first run-in with Nightcrawler, he was the first person to genuinely try and reach out to her in a calm manner. He wanted to explain how his powers worked and was going to try and get Rogue to join the team in the most human way possible. If it wasn't for the fact that Kitty came in and kind of ruined it at the end point of his conversation with Rogue, because I believe he was truly getting through to her. Kurt has a special connection to Rogue, but unfortunately in this instance, Kitty messed it up. And a few episodes later, we're finally going to see Rogue make the change to join the X-Men for reasons explained in my Rogue video, so if you want more details on that, there'll be a card linked above. All of that was said just to simply set up that Rogue is officially a member of the X-Men, and that she will be spending time with the team, as well as spending time with Kurt, because just about every character gets an episode with Kurt. Shout out Zuko. Okay, getting to more plot relevant stuff. When I had said that Kurt and Rogue shared a special bond, here is what I mean. Before they even know that they are siblings, which yes, they are, big spoiler, regardless, before they even know they're siblings, Kurt and Rogue share a very similar background. Both of them have powers in which outcast them even among mutant kind. Both of them happen to be adopted, not knowing who their biological parents are at all. And both of them seem to just be trying to figure it out in different ways. And I think it's also an interesting dynamic that both characters took their personalities in such vastly different ways. Rogue became more reclusive and stuck to herself and became a goth. Nightcrawler, on the other hand, is extraordinarily outgoing and happy and just wants to make his presence felt. It also provides a nice contrast to their powers. You wouldn't know Rogue is any different than anybody else unless you touched her, but Nightcrawler you know is different immediately, and yet his personality doesn't really display that because of how outgoing he is, whereas Rogue's personality has taken on being extremely reclusive. I do love this parallel from this show, and I also think it's another benefit towards making Rogue a goth throughout this show, rather than just having her being normal Southern. And so that leads to an episode that is completely centered around both characters. Rogue is having terrible nightmares in which she is a woman running from a medical facility carrying a baby she ended up having to drop over a set of railings on a shittily constructed bridge, and unfortunately abandons. And Rogue believes this baby to be Kurt, considering the kid was blue, and she also just feels it. She feels as though it is Kurt.
What are you talking about?
In the dream, there was a baby crying. Someone, a woman I think, I didn't really see her face, was running, and the baby was dropped into the river.
And you think that baby was me?
For Kurt, this is extraordinarily exciting. He wants to see who his biological mother was. He's excited at the prospect of figuring out who his parents possibly could have been. So he immediately rushes to Xavier. He seeks desperately to understand who his biological parents are. And of course, being the way Kurt is, he would also expect Rogue to want to see this too. He would expect Rogue to also feel the same way. But Rogue, despite being adopted, doesn't seem to really care to figure out who her biological parents were at all. It doesn't really interest her, not in the way in which it interests Kurt at least. And so we start to see a disconnect.
You sure you want to know?
What? Of course. Hey, wouldn't you? I mean, haven't you ever wondered who your real parents were?
I guess so, yeah, sometimes. But Irene was always a good mom to me. I mean, sometimes she could be real strict and all, but...
My adoptive parents were great too, but I always felt that they were keeping something from me.
Now, I do think that partly Rogue knows who Kurt's mother is at this point and is simply trying to dissuade him from going after her, that being Mystique, because I feel like Rogue knows by this point that it's Mystique and simply doesn't want Nightcrawler to be too hurt by this fact. So Nightcrawler honestly gets upset, and who wouldn't? He shares this dream of finally being able to find out who his biological parents are, and nobody around him seemingly wants to give him any sort of answers, nor help him find any answers. And so when he is given his very first opportunity to get answers, he jumps at it. He is given a letter letting him know that he needs to meet somebody by sundown at an old construction yard. And Nightcrawler jumps at the chance because he wants to understand who his biological parent is. And unfortunately, when he finds out who it is, it might have honestly done more damage than good when he sees that it is Mystique. He is not only befuddled, but angry. Very angry.
You already know me, son.
No! No, it's impossible! What happened to me? Why didn't you?
It probably also doesn't help that the Brotherhood decided to turn this into an ambush in which they're going to attack Nightcrawler now. Even though Mystique didn't plan this, there's no way Nightcrawler doesn't know that she didn't, and so therefore sees this as a slight against him, leading to more, honestly, terribleness in their already pretty messed up family life. So not only does this leave Nightcrawler questioning if Mystique is actually his own mother, but it also just leaves him extremely sad and upset that he doesn't even have any real answers. This whole investigation simply led him to having more questions than he will ever have answers, at least at this moment. And of course, Rogue is truly trying to be there for Nightcrawler throughout the entire episode. As a matter of fact, the two characters have an amazing heart-to-heart at the end of the episode, in which Rogue promises that they will find answers together, even though we all as the audience know Rogue already has the answers and is simply trying to spare Nightcrawler from any more pain.
Let's just wait till the prof finds more answers for you. Then you'll know for sure.
Somehow, I think he already knows more than he's willing to tell us.
Maybe. But if he does, he's probably got good reasons for not telling you.
Yeah, sure.
It's honestly quite a somber ending to the episode, where Rogue actually takes on the more positive outlook on the entire situation. It's almost as though the two characters swap places for a few minutes, in which Kurt is just extraordinarily down, which is not too far out of how things work like this in the real world. And it's really nice that those two characters had this parallel and this heart-to-heart at the end of this episode. But I also feel like I would be doing a genuine disservice if I didn't speak on Kurt's mother, Mystique, and how she went through her own set of challenges this episode. Much like Kurt, Mystique feels genuinely terrible for leaving him. As much of a terrible person as Mystique is, it is very clear that she cares about her children. She left Rogue in the hands of Destiny, one of her lovers, as somebody to keep an eye on her. She was genuinely trying to get away from Magneto and bring Kurt to safety previously throughout the flashback that we saw, and just simply unfortunately lost him. She is kind of wanting to be a good mother in her own twisted and honestly really messed up ways, because Mystique can't be a mother, at least not in the way that matters. But I think it's really important to note that she genuinely tries and that she genuinely wants what's best for her kids, even if what she believes is best really isn't. Now, I did, full disclosure, make an entire video based on this episode solely a few months back. Most of that episode, though, was spent criticizing Xavier's treatment of Nightcrawler and his unwillingness to tell him. If you're interested in that video, I'll pin it up probably the top right of your screen with a card. But focusing in on Mystique once again, I don't even think she knew that Nightcrawler was her son and that he was even going to a school in which she would be in such close proximity to him, just due to the fact of how surprised and shocked she was when Xavier had confronted her. Mystique genuinely seemed baffled by this, and her immediate instinct was to try and get information on Kurt and to make sure that he was doing okay at the school. She went out of her way to genuinely spy on Kurt and to transform into one of his classmates in the hopes that she could get to see how he's handling all of this. She went out of her way to genuinely try and reach out to Kurt and to give him the answers that he seeks in regards to whom his biological mother is. It's just unfortunate that she trusted this information to Pietro, who decided to use this as an option to ambush Nightcrawler and basically ruin Mystique and any chance she had at getting to know her son in general, something that I think she deeply regrets and that we'll see reverberate throughout the rest of the seasons. I also think it was very interesting for Professor X to just decide not to tell Nightcrawler about his past. Like I said previously, I made an entire video covering that, in which will be linked probably in the top right, just like the previous video was. Again, I don't necessarily agree with Professor X's decision not to, but I can completely see why he doesn't, as something like this might totally break Nightcrawler's worldview. But in the event of not ending this video on a super somber tone, I do want to highlight one more relationship Nightcrawler has in this show, one that's very, very positive, and one that also will take us a few episodes back at the start. Nightcrawler and Kitty have quite the unique relationship in this show, especially at the beginning. You see, when we get to meet Kitty as a character, she is completely brand new to this whole mutant thing. She isn't really used to it, and as a matter of fact, still considers mutants, and herself by extension, to be freaks. And so she would just personally rather not interact with them, and her experiences, especially with Kurt in the beginning, are not exactly those of an ally. She pretty much is completely creeped out by Kurt in general, and especially because of how touchy and up close Kurt can be, this was extraordinarily uncomfortable for Kitty, who just did not seem interested in him at all. Kurt felt like this was his safe space, and so he was being very much himself, using his tail, using his powers, not really realizing just how much this might creep out Kitty. Not that Kitty's response is necessarily the best, but she's like 15.
She's fully not into the fuzzy dude. Not that I really blame her.
Aw, she just needs time, Kurt. She'll come around.
We get to see multiple instances of her just being completely weirded out by Kurt throughout the episode. At one point, they do get in the X-Jet to go fly and find Rogue. Yes, this is the third episode of the show, as I said earlier, covering these things a little bit out of order just by the nature of how Kurt's character is. But back on topic, Kurt is flying the X-Jet and is kind of just getting around and goofing off, basically, being himself. And once again, unfortunately, that ends up backfiring in his face when he falls into Kitty's lap, of which Kitty just completely freaks out. She has zero interest of being around Kurt at all.
Frightened Kitty.
Sorry, Kitty.
Just like, stay away from me.
But the reason I bring all of this up and the reason I highlight it is that essentially this entire episode is used to give Kitty perspective on mutants and how mutant kind works in general. Her entire thing with this episode is learning to accept being a mutant and learning to accept those different from her, which is kind of something they try to do in the comics with Kitty, except they just made her say the N-word. We don't talk about that. We don't talk about that. Regardless, back on track once again. Kitty is essentially finding solace in Nightcrawler as a mutant, and as well is extremely happy to be near him now, mainly because Nightcrawler saved her life. She started to not see Nightcrawler as any different from herself, and to simply just be another extension of her family. It was a huge character step for Kitty, especially in the early episodes. And of course, to build on this, like with most characters, they gave Kitty another episode in which she spends a majority of the time with Nightcrawler. In this episode, Kitty is pretty much lamenting the fact that she cannot find any time to herself in the X-Mansion. She has a roommate in Rogue who is very messy and noisy, something Kitty finds very annoying. She doesn't get any time in the mess hall or the bathrooms because majority of it is communal and everybody else in the house is trying to get everything done, especially with the new addition of Spike to the team and Rogue. She feels overcrowded, like she can't get any space to herself. And so of course, before school, she decides to go hide out in the X-Jet, seeking somewhere she can simply type up an email to her folks and be alone about. But Kurt, of course worried about her being late for school, decides to go and find her, because to him, their relationship is important, and it's important for him to make sure that she is on time, much like how Cyclops made it important for him to be on time previously. In my mind, this is just his way of paying it forward to what is, in all reality, kind of like his little sister in retrospect when it comes to these characters. Now, in typical comic book shenanigan fashion, they end up on the X-Jet in which Logan, who is being mind-controlled by the dude who started the Weapon X program, is now flying them to Canada, losing his mind and desperately trying to attack both characters. But once again, this entire episode isn't really focused on Kurt. Instead, it's focused on Kitty and Logan's relationship and building out and fleshing out those two characters. Kurt is simply there because he is the best supporting character to help do so. He plays off Kitty extremely well, and since a majority of what we see in this episode is those two characters, they do a really good job of being the centerpiece, with Kurt kind of playing second fiddle and comic relief for a majority of the episode. And he's also there for Kitty throughout the entirety of it. He understands that she feels like she doesn't get enough time to herself, and that sometimes being a part of such a large family is overwhelming. This episode for Kitty serves to show her that being part of this huge family is honestly more beneficial than it is detrimental, and Nightcrawler is also there to help reinforce that message. So by the end of the episode, what we see is Nightcrawler really stepping into his role as sort of the pseudo older brother of Kitty, and not only comforting her after they believed that Logan had blown himself up and potentially died, but also in getting her to find time where she can write an email and be by herself, where Kurt actively holds the rest of the X-Men out of the mess hall just to give Kitty a few extra minutes to herself.
Hey man, come on. Just relax. Give her a minute. Nobody's gonna starve to death.
It's honestly a really sweet ending to the episode, and if I remember correctly, this is just the beginning foundations of these two characters' relationships. Now the show will go on to further focus more on Kurt and Rogue, especially when it's revealed that they are siblings, but I did love these little miniature interactions we got with Kurt regarding having a sort of family in the X-Men. Now, I do think that he isn't given a whole lot to do in the two-part finale of this season, but it would be disingenuous if I didn't mention the fact that he does meet Mystique once again, but neither of the characters mention that they're related, nor do they really do much to further his character or anybody else's. He's kind of just there in the finale to be there because he's part of the team, just like a majority of the other characters, as the finale I would argue is more focused on Scott, Jean, Professor X, Magneto, and maybe Scott's brother, but he was kind of just introduced. So honestly, he isn't given much to do from that two-part series, but he's just fun to see. And that's part of what makes some of these characters great, is they're just fun to have shown on camera. I mean, just look at what they have Kurt wearing when he thought he could finally go to the beach and take the X-Jet out for something he wanted to do for fun. Dude just comes out dressed, ready to go, and just kind of looks funny in all honesty. Kurt is just so upbeat and such a great character in this show. I feel like they captured comic book Kurt well, except for one very specific aspect, and that's his religion. Kurt's religion isn't mentioned at all. Despite that being a huge part of his character, not only is it never really mentioned in the show, it's never shown. And I think that's the one part of the character they missed so hard on, which is crazy because we see that Kitty's heritage and her religion is shown fairly well, especially later into the show. And that's simply something they don't do with Kurt that I wish they did. But aside from that, because they really never gave an explanation as to why they didn't do it, I think that this version of Kurt was extremely well done, and he's one of my favorites outside of, say, the comics. And thankfully they didn't go the Ultimates route. We don't talk about Ultimate Kurt. God, was Spider-Man really the only good thing to come out of that comic book series? To think that was my first look into the Marvel Universe. Anyways, I just want to take a second to say thank you all for watching. I mean, I really enjoy making these videos, and your continued viewership is what allows me to keep making them. Once again, thank you all so much for watching. If you want to support the channel, please leave a like, it helps out a lot. If you want to leave a dislike, please leave a dislike, and then down below in the comments tell me why. I believe constructive criticism is the best way for me to create better content for all of you guys. If you want to sub, it's free and you can always unsubscribe later. And finally, I do run a Patreon for $1 a month, in which you can not only just support me as a creator, but you can also see all of these videos early and completely unedited. As well, if you do join, you will gain access to the Discord, where I host weekly watch-alongs of movies and just get to interact with each and every one of you on a more regular basis outside of YouTube. And as well, if you are in the $5 or above tier, you will be shouted out at the end of each and every one of my videos, just like these lovely people here: eSibert13, Gabriel LaFonte, Transgers1, VideoGamer75, GoldenBoy420, Dakota Rawson, Donovan Gomez, and MCBomb27. You all are amazing. Thank you all so much, and I hope you all have an absolutely fantastic day.